Des Moines, Iowa, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We are in Iowa, I suppose, obviously, to cover these caucuses, which are starting just a few hours from right now. It's a sunny day. It's mid-tropics out here in the mid-30s, which is really good, perhaps, for voter turnout. And we're going to bring you some very special coverage with a very special political team here of Rick Davis, who has covered more than one political campaign himself, including out here in Iowa, including for John McCain, and also with Jeannie Zaino, who is political science professor at Iowa College. So welcome. It's great to have both of you
on my side
here for the whole duration. Okay, so Rick, give us the horse race. Let's get to the chase. Who's going to win?
This is the first outing, right? And it's all about who comes in first and who gets a ticket to New Hampshire. So expectations are pretty ripe right now that Sanders has got a big organization. He spent the last 4 years running for these caucuses, and he better come in first because everyone thinks he's going to.
He's got a big organization. He's got a lot of passion by all accounts behind him. Is that going to help the Democrats pick the right candidate to win in November?
It may help Bernie come in first here. At least they're hoping. They said they knocked on 500,000 doors this time out, and that is huge numbers in Iowa. But I think to Rick's point, if he doesn't meet or exceed expectations out here, that would be a huge story. We expect him to come in first at this point. So I think now the real question is what happens with 2nd through 4. And of course, Joe Biden is hoping he can eke out a 2nd place here. But there's a lot of energy behind Mayor Pete and Elizabeth Warren and even Amy Klobuchar.
Well, exactly. And not to go to the dark side here, Rick, but who has the most to lose? Is it Joe Biden, the former vice president?
It's the one person that you didn't mention, and that's Joe Biden, the former vice president, who also has a long track record dating back 35 years running in Iowa in 2 previous presidential campaigns. And he's got a lot to lose. He was the presumptive front runner when he entered the race, even though Bernie's had more activity recently here in Iowa. And if he doesn't come in 2nd or 3rd, he's going to be seen as being written out of the script coming out of Iowa.
Well, it's fascinating, Jeannie, in talking to some of the Biden campaign people out here, they immediately say, we'll always have South Carolina. It's sort of the response to what Rick just said. Well, wait till we get to South Carolina. Is that an indication they're a little bit doubtful about how they're going to come out in the first couple?
It's either an indication they're a little doubtful or they're really good at lowering this expectation. So no matter how he does, he'll do better. But money is his big problem if he doesn't do well here. It makes it tough. And then South Carolina voters are pragmatic. They may see him as somebody Iowans didn't want to choose, and they may look elsewhere. So while he has a really good stronghold with the African Americans there, that could wither away if he doesn't do well.
Okay, I'm so happy that Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino will be here with us throughout the day and the evening. But in the meantime, as we head into these Iowa caucuses, let's start off by giving you an explanation of exactly what they are, how they work, and how it may be different this year.
The Iowa caucuses are the first presidential contest on the calendar, and they're much different than a traditional primary. Democrats operate theirs like this. Caucuses will take place in all of Iowa's 1,678 precincts, plus 99 satellite locations. Once gathered, caucus goers will select their choice of president by splitting into groups. A candidate needs at least 15% of the room to remain viable. Otherwise, their supporters are released and open to select another candidate. And precinct captains will use all manners of persuasion to win additional support. From there, the second and final count is taken. Then the state party calculates how many state delegate equivalents each candidate has won at each caucus location. For the first time, the Iowa Democratic Party will report the results from all rounds of voting, but the key numbers are the state delegate equivalents.
For more on what to expect tonight, we're joined now by Chief Washington Correspondent Kevin Cirilli. He's been out here for some time all around the state, but right now he's across town in Des Moines. Kevin, give us an update.
All right, here's the update. I was speaking with some staffers on Pete Buttigieg's campaign who are incredibly optimistic about the momentum that they're hoping to seize upon coming out of the Iowa caucuses. Here's why. They're optimistic that Biden's campaign would not have a strong showing here. And if that becomes the case, then they would seek to contrast themselves with the Biden campaign as the centrist alternative to Joe Biden. However, that said, Bernie Sanders, a lot riding on this, a lot of high expectations that we've been noting about, that he win this caucus and then head into New Hampshire where he's perhaps even more dominant there. But the bottom line, and this is what I would be watching for, especially as those results come in later this evening, 15%. That's the viability threshold. Remember, in a caucus for these lower tier candidates, Elizabeth Warren, Andrew Yang, Amy Klobuchar, if they don't hit 15% in the caucus, their voters, their supporters have to decide, David, where they're going to go next. And that's why for these poll numbers, when you look at them, who folks' second option is becomes incredibly important. For Yang, it's less likely to be Bernie Sanders and actually more likely to be Pete Buttigieg. That could have some significant impacts on the dynamics of this race.
Okay, thank you so much to Bloomberg's Kevin Cirilli reporting from Des Moines. We're going to have much more with him throughout the day and into the evening. But right now, it's time to find out what's going on in the markets. A lot going on in the markets, particularly in Asia. And we go to Abigail Doolittle in New York for that.
Thanks, David. And lots of action for the markets, as you were just mentioning, around coronavirus fears, waiting for earnings, and, of course, also around those Democratic caucuses there in Des Moines, Iowa. Taking a look at the S&P 500 and the Dow, we see gains, nice gains, solid gains, but off the highs. At the highs, up more than 1%, headed at that point to the best day since October. This, of course, after last week, the big sell-off for the S&P 500 and the Dow, the worst week going back to August on fears that the coronavirus could really impact global economic growth. And now the question being to what degree, and suggesting that there could be a strong degree of impact and that it may, in fact, continue to impact stocks. Take a look at the commodity complex. This has really been an area of weakness since the breakout of the coronavirus, or really since it's been reported on widely. That Bloomberg Commodity Index down 1%. Crude oil down 2.4%. Flirting, WTI crude flirting with that very important $50 a barrel mark. Should it go lower? Of course, there was a Bloomberg scoop over the weekend saying that it said that China demand for oil is dropping by 20% on the coronavirus fears. China overall, the world's largest user of natural sources. So that's really hitting the commodity complex. Not just today, David. Over the last 2 weeks, if we take a look at a comparative chart of the S&P 500 to the Bloomberg Commodity Index, we are going to see both are down. The S&P 500 down about 2%. But take a look at that commodity complex down more than 6.5%. Not down just on oil weakness, but also copper. Of course, as 2/3 of the Chinese economy is shut down, including factories, copper being used less. So the hot area to watch in terms of a market barometer, David, for the reaction by markets to coronavirus fears, really commodities, what the commodities do. It seems likely, as has been happening so far, that stocks could follow. But today, a little bit of a rebound here for stocks at this point. Commodities remain rather weak, David.
Okay, Abigail, we'll keep our eye on those commodities. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle in New York. And also in New York is Ritika Gupta. She's here with First Word News. Ritika?
Thanks, David. House managers are urging the Senate to remove President Trump from office. The impeachment trial convened today to hear closing arguments, with the House managers and Trump's defense each getting 2 hours. After that, the Senate floor will be open for members to explain which way they plan to vote. The final decision is scheduled for 4 p.m. Wednesday, when President Trump is almost certain to be acquitted. Now the coronavirus outbreak is having an impact on U.S.-China trade. Bloomberg has learned that Chinese officials hope the U.S. will agree to some flexibility in their Phase 1 trade deal. The agreement is supposed to take effect the middle of this month, but there's a provision that the two countries will consult if an unforeseen event delays either from complying. China has promised to buy an extra $77 billion of U.S. goods in the first year. The British government plans to announce new rules for convicted terrorists. That's after an Islamic militant who was recently released from prison stabbed 2 people in South London. It was the second such attack in 3 months. Police shot and killed the attacker. The government will effectively stop the early release of extremists. It would also double terror sentences. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi says the protests against his government's citizenship law are a political diversion meant to distract voters ahead of next week's state election in Delhi. Thousands, especially students, have taken to the streets to protest the law. It seeks to grant citizenship to illegal immigrants of all faiths from Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, except Muslims. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Ritika. Coming up here, he's considered a rising star in Iowa politics. We'll talk with Rob Sand. He is the state auditor here. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin out here in Des Moines, Iowa. We've come for the Iowa caucuses, and we're back now with Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino. And we're now joined by Rob Sand, the Iowa state auditor. He was elected in 2018 and was the only non-incumbent Democrat to win statewide that year. So congratulations, first of all, on your victory.
Thanks.
Great to have you here, Rob. So the account of you is basically when Democrats want to win in Iowa, which is often thought to be a Republican state, they come to ask you how you do it. So what do you tell? What do you tell Pete Buttigieg?
Sure,
what do you tell
sure.
Elizabeth Warren?
First I tell them, I don't have a primary.
That's a good
So
answer.
you should discount anything that I have to say because what I was doing was focusing on winning in general. But beyond that, though, Iowa, while we don't have the same, we talk a lot about the lack of racial diversity in Iowa, but the fact of the matter is we still have minority communities here. They are still an important part of the makeup of the state and the makeup of the Democratic Party. So even though people tend to think, bucolic, I might be sort of, in a way, a stereotypical Iowan in the sense that I grew up in a small town and my first job was catching chickens and I like to hunt. You can still find the same kinds of voters that you find in every other part of the country. And if you're not looking for them here, then you are going to be missing out.
I always thought catching chickens and getting votes was close to being the same thing.
Yeah. Everything's a little bit slippery. You want to try to do a good job without getting too dirty, right?
Hey, Rob, you're the last statewide elected official who, came out of the Democratic Party recently. And let's talk about, the elections and the general election. Let's just skip right over this caucus because it's happening today.
Right.
Let's think about the future. Iowa's been a battleground state for the last two presidential cycles. We heard from the Democratic Party yesterday that the candidates are going to spend 44 weeks in these early primary states and only 5 weeks cumulative, in the battleground states. Maybe Iowa's going to be both. What's your prediction for the general election here?
It doesn't matter who the Democratic Party nominates. Iowa is going to be a battleground state. People look at the fact that Trump won by 9.5 here and they think, wow, that's a big margin. Well, Obama won by a similar margin in 2008. And think about this. We have been the first state for a while now. 2006 to 2008, all of the Republican presidential wannabes were coming to Iowa bad-mouthing Hillary Clinton because she was the presumptive nominee in 2008. In 2016, for that 2-year period, while they're coming out here, they are all coming to Iowa bad-mouthing Hillary Clinton because, again, she was the presumptive nominee. So there's this 4-year period where local media in Iowa was talking a lot about Republicans coming here and hitting Hillary Clinton, that maybe it wasn't quite as widespread as it was in the rest of the country, which I think made Iowans a little more reticent to support her overall.
So we've been hearing and talking a lot about electability, and is that the number one issue on Democrats' minds? Because one of the senses I think we've all gotten is that there's still, we're hours away, there's a high level of undecideds. Is that all about electability and making sure Iowa chooses the person who's going to go on to be the nominee?
I think a lot of it is, there's two pieces of it. One, Behavioral Science 101 says there's the paradox of choice. You got 2 tubes of toothpaste in front of you, you pick one. If you got 10, you don't know what to do. And it's the same thing with candidates. In 2016, it was easy. Either you fell into one camp or the other, but now there's a lot of options and that's harder to choose. Electability is important, but the other piece of that is, there's a lot of systemic structure around ideology as being encompassing all of electability, but there's a piece of it that comes down to authenticity, that comes down to character, that comes down to personality, that's a lot harder to measure. And you can't look at someone's, it's much easier to look at someone's policy statements and say their ideology than it is to characterize those other pieces of it. So the electability conversation, I think, in reality is much more complex than we normally talk about it.
So Rob, let me cut through that and have a different take on it. Are Iowans really going to go to the caucuses and say we should have a socialist as our next president? We tend to think of Iowa as not as a particularly radical state.
Right. I think, as Bernie says, he says he's a democratic socialist, right? There's a distinction there. But here's the big picture. You could run as a monarchist. If you get elected president, you're still not the king, right? We know that we have a system of checks and balances in our country. And one of the things that Sanders talks about a lot that really resonates with people is how broken the system is. And he's not new to it, right? He's been saying it his whole life. And so I think in that sense, while people might not be excited about the idea of someone who doesn't support capitalism, I myself would consider myself a capitalist. At the same time, there are other things that he does talk about that I think resonate with people.
But let me ask you this, Rob. having a broken system is one thing. Being opposed to capitalism versus supporting socialism another. We know, Iowa is a pretty mainstream state, regardless of what we see turn out tonight in the caucuses.
Right.
And you're a great representation of that. They just voted for you, and you're coming from a pretty mainstream economic point of view here.
Right.
And, is this state going to embrace someone who goes out and actively campaigns with socialist economic policies in a general election?
I think it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I know the last Iowa poll on the general that I saw had Sanders performing not as well against Trump as most of the other candidates, right? So I think there's a number of people who won't want to be supportive. I think that's indisputable, and I think that Democratic Socialist label is a piece of that. But at the same time, look at who he's running against.
Yeah.
We have someone who he's running against where they both originally, they've said they don't want to start new wars, but one of them has always been saying that, the other was relatively new to it and has already nearly started one or two. So
nearly is the key term there.
thank goodness.
Thank goodness, right?
That it went the way that it did.
Exactly.
But this is the bigger point to me, right? Everybody, when they vote, understands that if you were to want to change our economic system or our social safety net, you have to pass laws to do that.
Sure.
Right? On the other hand, foreign policy is the most single unchecked area of a president.
Yep.
And if you're someone that doesn't want a unpredictable person in the White House, then you might think, well, I don't like either of these choices, but here's one that isn't going to start wars, and in the meantime, he'll be checked and changing the legislature through legislative bodies in the House and the Senate.
Really important point. Thank you so much to Rob Sands. He is Iowa State Auditor. Great to have you here. And still ahead, we're going to talk about the coronavirus. That outbreak already has been taking a toll on China's growth in 2020. Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus, spoke to me about how China's response to this outbreak is different from when SARS hit 16 years ago. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From Des Moines, Iowa, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. The coronavirus has been spreading, with now more than 17,000 cases, claiming more than 300 lives. Chinese officials are considering lowering their 2020 growth targets, and they're also seeking flexibility, reportedly, in its Phase 1 trade deal with the United States. Joining us live from Hong Kong is Yvonne Mann. Yvonne, what's the latest?
Well, the latest, as you mentioned here, that China perhaps is asking for some kind of leeway here when it comes to this Phase 1 deal. I guess it's understandable given the fact that they did come up with some pretty ambitious pledges here of $200 billion purchases of U.S. goods within 2 years. And even before this virus broke out, David, there were a lot of questions on whether China could actually have the capacity to fulfill those promises as well. And under that Phase 1 trade deal, there is a bit of a paragraph here that mentions that the U.S. and China will consult in the event that a natural disaster or other unforeseeable events delays either from complying or not sure yet if there has been these such consultations. But yeah, the U.S. certainly would be thinking about this as well, given the fact that Larry Kudlow did mention that these are two separate issues here, a humanitarian issue and a trade issue. So this doesn't exactly give the U.S. any type of leeway, and the U.S. also assisting Beijing in their efforts to fight this outbreak as well. But that certainly would be a big development.
Okay, Yvonne, thank you so much for reporting from Hong Kong throughout this crisis. And now we're going to turn to the coronavirus and Max Baucus, former U.S. ambassador to China. I caught up with Max Baucus and asked him about the ongoing concerns surrounding the coronavirus and specifically how China's response to the deadly virus differs from when SARS hit there 16 years ago.
China this time around is much more open about the coronavirus than it was about the SARS virus not too many years ago. And it's also an opportunity for China. If China can show that it has taken care of the problem, they can get it under control, then that will raise China's stature as a country that is in the forefront of finding a way to deal with a vicious problem. It is a big problem. The army in Wuhan, where this broke out, going around different houses and apartments, and they're finding dead people. Dead people because people who were unable to go to the hospital were turned away, so they go back to their apartments and is found dead. There are about it's 14,000 cases today. Over 300 people died in China today, And there's also reports now of deaths in other countries. So it's really serious. The government knows it's serious, and President Xi also knows that he's kind of under the gun now. So the people of China and also the people around the world, especially the people in China, are going to be looking at him. Is he going to handle this well? Is he going to be our guy that we can trust in the future? And it depends on how well he handles it.
If, in fact, the nature of the regime made it difficult in the early stages,
yes,
perhaps the disease got a foothold because they didn't have the bottom-up reporting you described. Have they turned around on that subject? For example, the United States has offered help. Are the Chinese accepting the sort of scientific and other help that the world's offering to fix this?
Well, there are a lot of companies in China that are going out of their way to give hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of masks and medical equipment to help the Chinese government solve the problem. I'm unaware, frankly, of efforts by the United States government or others, but I do know within China there are a lot of very, very wealthy people. I talked to one just 2 days ago. His company is giving lots of money and finding masks. The trouble is there's insufficient supply of the right kind of masks in China. So they're struggling with it. But I give them credit for recognizing the problem now. Perhaps they could have recognized it earlier, but at least they do now and doing all they can.
That was part of my conversation with former ambassador to China and former senator from Montana, that's Democratic Senator Max Baucus. Max Baucus was actually out here because he endorsed Joe Biden, the former vice president, in the caucuses coming up tonight, saying why he thinks that's really the right way for the Democratic Party to go. But specifically, we talked to him about China, and he said in the next few days will be critical to figure out whether this continues to expand or whether it really trails off. In addition to Max Baucus, the former senator and former ambassador to China, I also caught up with the Democratic presidential candidate Tom Steyer. Had a conversation with him to ask him what he thinks about the state in play here in Iowa and beyond. And we asked him specifically, would he be willing to endorse other candidates if, in fact, he didn't get the nomination? Could he support them? He said he'd support any of them because the most important thing for him is to beat Donald Trump. We remember that Tom Steyer backed impeachment several times of the President of the United States. And we'd love you to stay with Bloomberg for complete coverage of the Iowa caucus. We're going to bring you special coverage starting tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. That's live from right here in Des Moines. And tomorrow, we have President Trump delivering his State of the Union address. We'll be back in New York and bring you live coverage of that on Bloomberg Television and Radio starting at 9 p.m. Eastern. This is Bloomberg. From Des Moines, Iowa, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Ritika Gupta back in New York.
Thanks, David. Hong Kong is taking new measures to contain the spread of the deadly coronavirus. The city will seal off more of its checkpoints with China beginning Tuesday. The moves comes after medical workers in Hong Kong began a strike aimed at forcing the closure of the border. The number of cases of the disease in China has now soared past 17,000. More than 360 have died. The Brexit battle between the UK and the European Union resumed today. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson clashed with the bloc's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, during trade talks. Barnier says the EU has offered the UK a highly ambitious deal, but only if Johnson agrees to adopt rules to prevent unfair competition. Johnson rejected that and said the UK will thrive, even if negotiations fail. Days after Gulf Arab states expressed their support for President Trump's Mideast peace plan, representatives from those same countries and other Muslim nations are rejecting the White House plan as biased. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan says the kingdom supports negotiations, but that the rights of the Palestinians must be protected. He spoke at a gathering for the 57-nation Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Turkey is trying to keep a deadly clash with Syrian forces from drawing in Russia. At least 6 people were killed and 7 wounded today in Idlib, the last major opposition area in Syria. Government forces there, backed by the Russian Air Force, are trying to defeat one-time al-Qaeda affiliates and Turkey-backed rebels. Turkish President Erdogan is urging Russia to stay out of the fray, saying its target is the Syrian regime. Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Ritika. We're back out in Iowa for those caucuses being held later on today and tonight. I spoke out here with Democratic presidential candidate Tom Steyer about his opponents and whether he'd be willing to support any of them if, in fact, he did not get the nomination.
The first thing I said on the debate stage was everyone on this stage is a million times better than Donald Trump. And I've said, I want to be the candidate because I believe I can beat Donald Trump. I believe I can take him down on what he says he's good at, which is the economy. But as someone who built a business from scratch, I can reveal him as the fake and the fraud and the failure that he is as a business person and as a steward of the American economy. But if it's not going to be me, I'll support any Democrat without any questions because they're all a million times better.
Including Bernie Sanders or including Elizabeth Warren.
Absolutely, without any qualms whatsoever. Look, we have to beat Mr. Trump in the fall. That means a couple of things. It means you're going to have to appeal to a diverse group of Americans. We have a very diverse country, and we have a very diverse Democratic Party. Whoever is going to be the Democratic nominee has got to be able to appeal to that diverse group of Americans and bring them to the polls. That's something, actually, if you look at the 4 early primary states, I can do. If you look at Nevada and South Carolina, I'm doing really well. I got the endorsement today of the Iowa, Nebraska head of the NAACP. If you're going to beat Donald Trump, you're going to have to beat him on the economy, and you're going to have to draw a diverse group of Americans to the polls to say, this is an absolute failed experiment. It's imperative that we turn the page on Mr. Trump and his whole band of Republicans.
That was part of my interview with presidential candidate Tom Steyer. We did that on Saturday, and we're going to play more of that in the next hour. In the meantime, here, we're joined by Deirdre DeGeer. She is a small business owner and is the former chair of the Kamala Harris campaign here in Iowa. She also ran for Secretary of State in 2018. Welcome. It's great to have you here, Deirdre.
I'm happy to be here.
So tell us about your party. We're all focused on this today, the Democratic Party in the state of Iowa. Why are so many people undecided? We see polls are saying 40, 45%.
You know, I think a large part of that is that we have so many great candidates that are out there really pushing people's values. And folks are trying to determine whether or not those candidates are going to have their best interests in the long run. And you know, I was just with a group of undecideds last night, and they were all over the place. But I think the intention of all of them, as many as I've talked to, is to actually caucus. It's just a matter of who it's going to be.
At the same time, there are some apparent choices available. There are 4 people sort of at the top, with Amy Klobuchar maybe number 5. You have a couple of people who are perceived as more moderate. Joe Biden, the former vice president, also the former mayor, Pete Buttigieg. A couple that are more progressive, and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Can't people decide whether they want to go progressive or conservative or moderate?
Sure. So what I'm seeing is that the progressive value set is something that definitely stimulates excitement in our party, and it gets people engaged. It gives them a reason to advocate. But when I'm finding people making their decisions, it's not necessarily the social values, it's the economic values that they're trying to connect with. When we look at our economy being broken, some would say that it's not broken, that it's working for folks. But at the end of the day, when we see black women getting paid 51 cents to the dollar, we know that the economy is working. When we see white women getting paid 80 cents to the dollar, we know the economy is not working. I mean, right here in Polk County, African Americans get paid $33,000 a year. Everyone else, $63,000 a year. The economy is not working, and so people really want to see what candidate is going to impact their pocketbook, their bottom line, to move their families forward.
At the same time, as we look at Iowa, it's not particularly representative of the rest of the country in terms of African Americans and even Hispanics.
Sure.
It's a fairly Caucasian state.
Sure. So
do people who are in the by far majority, over 90%, do they still really feel strongly about the inequities that you're describing?
You know, what I'm finding throughout the entire state is that people are keening into this idea of disparities being real for so long. In fact, I was just at an event this past week talking about the 1619 project with Anna Nicole, and folks were very, very outright in their opinion, in that some of them even said, I didn't get taught this stuff in school. I didn't understand the impacts of slavery and how it could show up today in modern times, and how our economy is a reflection of those prehistoric value sets that were never intended for African Americans. And so in that small group of people, it was about 200 folks, predominantly white individuals. It was an open forum discussion about coming to terms with what the implications of slavery have done to us, and what our economy has done, and the unintended consequences and that impact on African Americans and minorities in general.
When your fellow Democrats go to the caucuses this evening, how important will it be to them who can beat Donald Trump as a practical matter, as opposed to somebody who resonates with me, I like their ideas?
So I'm a little bit contrary to the big idea that Donald Trump is our enemy. Of course, that is what everyone is talking about, because our party has done a great job of helping people understand how much of a stumbling block that president is for us as a country. But needless to say, I honestly believe that Donald Trump is not our enemy. He's just what I said. He's a stumbling block. And this is why I say that. In 2016, our party chair says that we had over 200,000 Democrats that typically vote in presidential races that did not vote. We saw the small numbers between Iowa, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Hillary Clinton lost by a total of 70,000 votes. And we get there and we see a result that says we've got a woman who wins a popular vote, and we've got a man who wins the Electoral College, and the man is the gentleman who takes on the prize. But the reason why we got there is because we had so many people who did not engage in the voter process. 2018 was our indicator. We had record turnouts throughout the entire country, and that showed us that the Democratic Party was not dead, and that people were still engaged. And so I think we're heading up to an upward trajectory. I know that we're headed up to an upward trajectory, and I would not say that undecided voters is an indicator of apathy, but apathy is our greatest enemy in this.
We're talking with Deirdre DeGier. She's a former candidate for Iowa Secretary of State, a very prominent member of the Democratic Party out here in Iowa. So let's go back to 2016, because in fact, Donald Trump took this state by 9 points or so, fairly successfully. Who are going to be the people who come out? You're saying it's not a question of switching the votes, persuading somebody who voted for Donald Trump to vote the other way, but rather get them to come out.
Exactly.
In a time when your unemployment rate, I think, is 2.6%, it's better than the national average. Who's going to come out and say, you know what, this time I'm really upset, if it's not because Donald Trump's the enemy? So
case in point, we're talking about disparities. We just were. That unemployment rate, about 2.25% for African Americans. That unemployment rate is 14%.
Wow.
So you've got a great deal of people out there who are feeling the brunt of this president. You look at our farmers who are dealing with a great deal of uncertainty that was stimulated by our president. People are not happy. And the numbers don't necessarily tell the story, but I think the votes are going to tell the story. The idea that we need to overcome our challenges through using our voice via the ballot box is becoming more and more of a solution over time.
You were involved in Kamala Harris's campaign,
I was.
which doesn't exist anymore at this point. Are you still undecided, or have you endorsed someone?
You know, I am undecided. I'm planning on making a decision actually right when I get off from here. I've got a good idea about who I would like to support, but more so than anything, I don't want who I'm supporting to be someone's reason. I want people's reason to turn out to the ballot box to be their own core-centric values, what means the most to them.
So give us a little insight into Iowa caucuses here. You're undecided. You're very sophisticated, very knowledgeable in politics, without a doubt. You're really open to being persuaded from what you hear in that caucus as different people argue with one another.
Oh, yes. I mean, even when I caucused in 2007 for Barack Obama, I walked into that caucus not an Obama supporter. I walked into that caucus supporting a candidate who did not end up being viable. Now, here I am, this college student caucusing for the first time ever. I had no idea what a caucus situation was, but was excited and thrilled to be a part of it. But it was through the caucus process that I was able to become an Obama supporter, because he had passionate people in that room that were vying for support and believed in their candidate. I mean, that's the nature of the caucus experience. It's unlike a primary election where it's just a private ballot. It's about you talking to your fellow community member, your fellow neighbor, exchanging values, exchanging interests, and then coming to terms with those at the end of the caucus.
It's an extraordinary process. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your views with us. That's Deirdre DeGier. She's a former candidate for Iowa Secretary of State. And a programming note now. Tomorrow, President Trump will deliver his State of the Union address. We will have live coverage on Bloomberg Television and radio starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin out in Des Moines, Iowa for those caucuses coming out this afternoon and evening. And we are joined once again by Rick Davis and by Jeannie Zaino. And in addition, we now have Jerry Crawford. He's a Democratic strategist and attorney. He's a longtime staple of Iowa politics and has been associated with presidential campaigns dating back to 1976. And he comes to us alongside, as I say, Jeannie Zaino and Rick Davis. So the interesting thing I just learned about you, you were here for the first caucus.
You know, it's hard to dress that up. It means you're really old. That's one thing that it means. But
don't talk about old. Don't talk about old.
It also means that you've seen just about everything, and you have a sense of how things might play out as you move through the process, and what would be. You know, I've had the pleasure and the honor of chairing 7 presidential campaigns in Iowa, and you want to give the best advice possible to the people you're helping, and. So it's useful that way, too.
Fantastic. So I want to take advantage of that sage knowledge that you've stored up over those 45 years of Iowa politics. We see a little bit of new polling activity around today. Obviously, we didn't get the benefit of the Des Moines Register poll on Saturday night, but some of that shows Buttigieg and Sanders in a dead heat, both increasing their viability, but at the same time, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren going down in the poll.
But not by a lot. It's still sort of margin of error stuff.
Biden dropped 9 points in 2 weeks.
True enough. Here's what I would say. The most startling thing about today's poll, which is done by former Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack, Lieutenant Governor Patty Judge, Jeff Link, the most surprising thing was that Buttigieg was on top in today's poll. There are going to be a couple of surprises tonight. Somebody's going to do way better than expected. That would be an example of Buttigieg doing way better than expected. Not that he's discounted, but he's not expected to win by any stretch of the imagination. And somebody inevitably will do worse than expected. I mean, I think we all know that, well, first of all, I would argue that Bernie Sanders has the most at stake. He needs to win tonight. Yeah. He has everything going his way. Yep. I mean, everything going his way. And then the vice president. Joe has to, he has to have a credible finish to get to New Hampshire, where he's got to have another credible finish. It depends on the margins. If he's in 4th place, but he's within 4, that's fine. But if he's in 2nd place and he trails by 8, that's not so fine. So it depends on the margins.
And we keep hearing that this is such an unusual year. Everything from the weather, which has been almost balmy in the last few days, to not the release of the poll. And then, of course, we're living through an impeachment trial. Is this year truly as unusual for somebody who's been through so many of these? And if so, what's unusual? Is it just there's so many people that are so tight in these polls? What's going on?
It is amazing that we still have so many people that are legitimate contenders, but let's not forget we started off with 26 candidates. Right. Yeah. I think the final number was. I had trouble keeping track. What is very usual that people tend to overlook, every 4 years, people think they have discovered something new called electability. Electability has been the most important thing as long as I've been involved, which, as we've already pointed out, is forever.
Not to dwell on it.
Not to go back to it unnecessarily. But, I think about half of Iowa doesn't know for sure what they're going to do tonight when they go into that caucus. And it's because they're trying so hard to get this right, so hard to figure out who can beat the current president, because that's what they care the most about.
And can I just follow and say, so with these new rule changes and so many people undecided, is there a possibility in some of these caucuses we see non-committed as something these people are stuck with because they're viable all of a sudden?
Uncommitted.
Or uncommitted.
Yeah, a lot of, I've talked to a number of people the last few days who are going to go caucus for Cory Booker, or who are going to go caucus for Michael Bennet. Or somebody who they are pretty confident won't be viable, so they can still preserve the right to move. Whereas if you go in as uncommitted, as you point out, and it's a very wise observation, that could be a viable group, and then you couldn't move
They could
anywhere.
get 15%, and all of a sudden they're stuck being uncommitted.
It's been a long time since uncommitted has jumped up, but uncommitted is actually, in the early days of the caucuses, won on caucus night.
Sure. Sticking with that theme, you mentioned a survey earlier. In that survey, 51% had made up their mind, but that means almost half haven't. Is that unusual at this late stage?
It's a little higher than we've seen in the past, but I think it's because they are trying to sort out who can win this thing in the general election. And as you go through our candidates, each of them has challenges. They've all acknowledged that, and that creates indecision in the minds of the voters.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Rick.
In the end of the day, someone's got to win Iowa in the general election. Which candidate who's running in the top tier right now is the best position to do that?
Among the current candidates, and we haven't talked about Bloomberg, who I think every day gets maybe a little closer to being a live threat.
Got to consider him in the top tier now.
Process, not in the first 4 states, but after that, absolutely. Here's what you need to watch for. Is there a muddle in Iowa and New Hampshire? And then the 2 states that follow, Nevada and South Carolina. If there's a muddle, his stock skyrockets as somebody because others simply won't have the resources come Super Tuesday.
So the winner of the February contest could be the one guy who's not in it.
That's right.
Okay. Jerry Crawford, Rick Davis, and Jeannie Zaino will be staying with us. And just to remind you, Michael R. Bloomberg is the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, which is the parent of Bloomberg News. Coming up, we're going to have much more on the Bloomberg caucuses with Jerry Crawford, Rick Davis, and Jeannie Zaino. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on television and radio. I'm David Westin out in Des Moines, Iowa. We're joined once again by Jerry Crawford, as well as our crack political team of Jeannie Zaino and Rick Davis in Des Moines, Iowa. We were just talking about this on the break, though. Let's talk about geography in Iowa. There are particular areas we should be looking at. I heard, for example, that Pete Buttigieg is really pushing the West.
He has, although my take is that his strongest voting bloc is suburban women. And that could be very important in Polk County. He had a crowd of right at 2,000 last night, right before the Super Bowl. That's a big crowd for a Super Bowl night event on caucus eve. I also haven't been able to figure out who is going to prevail in Cedar Rapids, which is the second largest community in our state. If Buttigieg is doing well in Cedar Rapids as well in this late breaking vote, as this poll today suggests, that's a big deal.
Yeah, one of the things we always used to say on the McCain campaign is ignore the polls and believe your eyes. The polls are all over the map on this one. It has various people in the lead and a lot of different, very tight positioning amongst the top 4 or 5. What are your eyes seeing? I mean, obviously you see that intensity on Buttigieg, but how about Sanders? I mean, some of the stories are that he really isn't putting on a show.
Listen, I think Sanders is going to win tonight. It's not necessarily who I'm for, but it's what I think will happen. And I think it would be a big, big loss for him not to win tonight. Any caucus state, not just Iowa, any caucus state leans left. He's been running here for 4 years. He has a very built-out organization, has had unlimited resources, financial resources. I mean, he really does need to win tonight. And listen, let me say this about Bernie Sanders. For all the other campaigns, they have to have a really effective organization to get their people to the caucuses tonight, right? You'd need a really effective organization to keep Bernie Sanders people away from the caucuses. They are zealous on his behalf.
So you don't think just because they're young means that they're not going to show up?
Absolutely not. In fact, I think it's just the opposite.
And you were just talking about Bernie Sanders' organization, which he's been building for years. But, you look in 2016 and you look at somebody like Ted Cruz, who wins in Iowa digitally. Is there any of that going on? We always talk about Iowa as such a retail state, but is it moving at all or morphing as we talk about these young folks who are so, energized into where you could have a really great digital game and win in Iowa?
I think that everybody heard you or expected you to say that about a year and a half ago because they all have good.
Yeah.
They all have good digital games. In terms of believing your eyes, last night was a very interesting situation where there was a Joe Biden event and a Buttigieg event within an hour of each other, and I talked to somebody who said everybody who was arriving at one event was taking off their stickers from the other event. Why are they going to all these events? Because 50% are undecided.
Still undecided.
They're still,
So they're
not just,
shopping,
they're just not out for the entertainment of the evening. They're trying to make up their mind and decide who can we put on the ballot that can get the job done.
Does all the changes this year mean that we're going to have an earlier evening? Do we know the answer
Yes.
earlier?
We will have an
He
earlier
says hopefully.
evening. We will have an earlier evening. Of course, the ultimate story will be told by the delegate equivalencies, but we're going to have raw vote total before that that'll give us a pretty good glimpse.
It's great. Really a treat to have you with us. That's terrific. Jerry Crawford, he's an attorney and Democratic strategist here in Iowa, has been there all the way back to 72 in the first caucus. Jeannie Zaino and Rick Davis are going to be staying with us for the next hour. And coming up, we will have a second hour live on Bloomberg television and radio. Also, there will be special coverage of the Iowa results starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg television and on radio. From Des Moines, Iowa, to our television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. This is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We are broadcasting today from the Marriott in downtown Des Moines, where in just 7 hours from right now, Iowans across the state will head to caucus locations, 1,861 precincts actually, kicking off the first contest in the 2020 presidential election. As Democrats search for their candidate to take on President Trump, joining us now is Chief Washington Correspondent Kevin Cirilli, also in downtown Des Moines, but not with us here in the studio. Kevin, what do you have for us?
Well, look, I think a couple of big takeaways for what we're going to be watching for tonight. First and foremost, can frontrunner Senator Bernie Sanders hold and secure victory? If he's able to do that, it will really inject a lot of momentum into his campaign. Meanwhile, what does all this mean for former Vice President Joe Biden? Is he able to pull off an upset and to beat Bernie Sanders? Is he also able to continue to move forward and finish in second place? But lastly, who's going to take the third spot? Is it Biden? That would be a disappointment for him. Or is it going to be South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg? And in fact, he's been talking not about impeachment, but about the economy, the gig economy. Take a listen to what he said yesterday at a rally I was at here in Des Moines.
We're going to be facing an economy profoundly reshaped by the emergence of technology, the role of gig work, things we barely understood just a few years ago. That's why we've got to make sure that we deliver an economy that values work over wealth and protects workers, whether you're a gig worker, a contractor, or an employee. We've got to make work pay in the United States of America.
The stakes are high for Buttigieg. The stakes are high for Amy Klobuchar, as Elizabeth Warren as well. They have to be able to justify that their campaign is going to have the cash and also the momentum heading into these next caucus and primary states.
At the same time, does Bernie Sanders have something at risk here because the expectations are so high for him right now?
No. You know, David, you and I were talking about this morning. Yes, he does, because the Emerson poll that came out just within the last 24 hours, he's leading that poll. Virtually every local newspaper here is writing and covering this as Bernie Sanders' race to lose. And as a result of that, should anything other than a first place finish, that would be an incredible disappointment for his campaign. That said, he is well positioned to have the infrastructure in New Hampshire, a state very close to Vermont geographically, and he also has a lot of small dollar donations. So he'll be able to continue onward. But to your point, from a expectations game, he's really expected to win this thing.
Okay, thank you so much for reporting. That's Chief Washington Correspondent Kevin Cirilli in downtown Des Moines. He's going to be with us throughout the afternoon and the evening, I must say. Joining me now for more on the Iowa caucuses is Jean Hesburgh. She's former executive director of the Iowa Democratic Party, also former Nevada Democratic Party caucus campaign consultant. And still with me, of course, are our great contributors, Bloomberg contributors, Jeannie Zaino of Iona College in Applied Techonomics, and Rick Davis, who managed John McCain's presidential campaign and is now a partner at Stone Court Capital. So, Jean, welcome. Great to have you here. So you know the Democratic Party in this state. What are we looking for tonight?
Well, we're looking for a large turnout.
Are you?
We're looking for, yes, absolutely. I think just the sheer number of candidates means large turnout, but the organizational effort that the Iowa Democratic Party has put into it is large turnout. And the satellite caucuses, large turnout. Everything that the Iowa Democratic Party has done so far means large turnout. And the excitement, looking at the anti-Trump sentiment among Democrats, all of that pushes to large turnout. So that's what I expect to see.
That's great. And also, I wanted to ask you about the change in the rules. This is the first time that you're not going to have an ongoing swirl of activity. You're going to have 2 votes, basically. And how will that reform the caucuses today?
Well, it should lessen perhaps the confusion in the room with first-round viability. And if you're viable, then you stay in that group. And there's not multiple rounds of viability. There's only 2 rounds of viability. So those people that are viable are locked into that first round, and they can no longer move. And so it's less jockeying around in the room this time. And so there's not as much confusion. And that will really affect those caucus sites that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in them. I think that was kind of hard to do last caucus cycle, and that's what I mean about expecting large turnout. So that will help in that effort. It will also shorten the length of the caucuses. So those people that said, oh, gosh, I don't want to go to a caucus, it might take too long, this will shorten the caucuses considerably. 2 rounds of viability and
maybe increasing turnout, too.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. They'll be shorter and zippier, and everyone should come out.
Yeah, and you were saying you first voted in the caucus in 1984,
Absolutely.
and your son is in college and he's voting this year.
He sure
so
is.
in terms of turnout with these young people, which is so important to a Bernie Sanders, are you expecting a large turnout? Because that seems to always be the question. They don't turn out in as large numbers as their older counterparts, but you're expecting that tonight?
Yes, and we always have to remember that caucuses, particularly in Iowa, are about party building. So everything we do about our caucuses is about building the Iowa Democratic Party, looking toward the November elections. So it is important to make the caucus apparatus attractive to younger voters, shortening the length, making the rules a little bit easier to understand. So having candidates that attract younger voters, and I wouldn't just say Bernie Sanders, but all of the candidates we have now have brought excitement to the younger vote. Ultimately, we do lose younger voters in the November election, so hopefully that excitement will continue to the November elections.
Gene, take us inside these caucuses, these precinct captains, as they're called.
Yes.
What are they going to be arguing about? Because we know what the positions are of the candidates. They've been out here an awful lot. Is it really going to come down to who's the most likely to beat Donald Trump come November?
I think so, yes. I'm a precinct captain. So
there you are.
Yep. I'm going to run my own precinct. My husband and I are precinct captains at a satellite location tonight. And I think that you're asking, I think, 2 questions, which is undecided voters. Are they going to be looking at electability? And it does sound like that is what the undecided voters are looking at, is electability, correct?
Let's talk about electability.
Yeah.
Iowa has been historically a battleground state in a general election. Candidates have probably spent more time per capita in this state this year than they're going to do in any other state.
Right.
And so the question is, will Iowa be competitive for Democrats, especially if they nominate someone like Bernie Sanders?
Iowa historically has always been competitive for Democrats. If you look historically about how Iowa votes in the November elections, Iowa's numbers for Democrats actually mirror the numbers of what Democrats receive electorally in November. Whether we elect a Democrat or not is the big question. But I think Iowa should be competitive if we play our cards right. If we do what we're supposed to do in the caucuses, it will increase the strength of the Iowa Democratic Party and increase voter turnout in November.
So what is the #1 issue on Democrats' minds this year? You know, the economy is fairly strong. Obviously, you've got a lot of farmers. But what is the issue? Is it electability?
I think so.
You think
beating
so?
Donald Trump in November.
Okay.
Who that candidate is remains to be seen. #1, beating Donald Trump, and number 2 is being unified. Whoever wins this whole process, let's unify in the end and get behind that person so we can beat Donald Trump.
You say it's going to be a battleground state, but Iowa went by 9 points for Donald Trump last time. Why are they going to change?
Well, we have to. That's why we're going to change. Okay?
Optimism on the day of the caucus.
We have to.
That's fantastic.
We have a competitive Senate race. We have congressional races. We have our legislature. We have to change. Remember, I worked at the Iowa Democratic Party. It's always optimistic, and we have to change. We don't always have to stay red. We haven't always been red. We have been blue. So I like to think of it as purple.
Okay. Thank you so much to Jean Hesburgh. She's former executive director of the Iowa Democratic Party. Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino will be staying with us, I'm happy to say. In the meantime, let's get a check on the markets. And we have what I understand is a massive rally going on with Tesla. Kaylee Lyons is in New York. Kaylee?
David, that is an accurate description. Right now, we're looking at shares of Tesla up about 16%, at one point up as much as 20%, on pace for its best day since 2013. Right now, the stock is trading at $757 a share, David. Now, there's two parts to this. One is Panasonic, which makes batteries for Tesla, turned a profitable quarter in part because Tesla has been ramping up production so much. So that is a positive sign for the electric car maker. You also had an analyst over at Argus Research raising his price target to $808 today. Of course, we are not far from that right now. David, I want to remind you that the average analyst price target on Tesla is about $467. So this stock has run incredibly far. Just so far in 2020, that's only been a month, the stock is up almost 90%. And since back in October, it has rallied more than 200%. So it's really been an incredible run. And really, Tesla today is helping to lift the NASDAQ 100, which is up by about 1.5% today. And if we flip up the board and take a look at the major equity indices, we'll see that even though, yes, last week was really, really painful, you did have stocks rebounding today with the S&P 500 higher now by about 0.9%. We are, however, off the highs of the session. And the worst performer in the S&P 500 today, David, is the energy sector, really lagging it. The sector is now at its lowest since back in December of 2018, and that has everything to do with the declines we're seeing in oil. WTI crude at one point today falling below $50 a barrel. We are hovering right now just above that $50 a barrel level. It is down in the past 20 days since the recent highs on January 6th, David, by 20%. And of course, we had Bloomberg reporting today that the coronavirus in China has knocked off China's oil consumption by about 20%. So that has crude much lower today, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Kaylee Lyons reporting from New York on Tesla. Coming up here, we're going to talk to Fred Hochberg. He's former chairman of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin out in Des Moines, Iowa, for the caucus is being held later on today. And one of the states here in Ohio, this is one of the states most exposed in the United States to trade conflict with China before the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal. Fred Hochberg is the former chairman and president of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. He joins us, but more importantly, he has a great book out called Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word. So, Fred, welcome. Let's talk about trade in Iowa.
Sure.
How important is it? As I understand, you actually researched your book some out here.
I actually came out here because this is an important state, partly because it does a lot of agriculture exports and a lot of farm equipment and construction equipment. So it looks at both sides of our trade, commodities and actually manufactured goods.
How badly was it hurt by the trade conflict with China?
The ag community was really, really badly hurt, very badly hurt. A lot of soybeans wound up rotting in silos. And I think the real tragedy of this, that even this Phase 1 agreement will not fix, is you've lost that customer. And whether they're going to want to put, quote unquote, all their soybeans in one basket and take a chance on selling to China when it's such a volatile and mercurial with our president, whether they're going to take that chance again, I don't know.
One of the things through the negotiations that struck a lot of people was how patient actually the farmers were with President Trump. They really stuck with him. At this point, now that Phase 1 is through, we'll see how much of it gets implemented, even with the coronavirus right now. But do you have a sense that people have forgiven him?
Well, I think the staying with him is they felt this guy's a smart guy. He's a businessman. He's a billionaire, which is one reason why we don't see his tax returns or everything else, because he wants to make sure that doesn't get, perception isn't changed. So he must be doing it for good economic reasons. So I think a lot of them actually did stick with him. I was quite surprised, and people were having a hard time. Some of them had to sell off land, couldn't meet their bank loans, and yet they were sticking with the president. So that was kind of remarkable, I thought.
So we got a phase one trade deal with a lot of big promises, I think it's fair to say, on agriculture and other things, equipment and machinery and things like that. Now we have a coronavirus, and we don't know where that goes, how bad it is. There are reports on the Bloomberg today that China may come back and say, you know what, that phase one thing, it's going to take us a little longer. Do you have any sense of the likely effect on trade, U.S.-China trade, global trade, from this coronavirus?
Well, I think one of the things the coronavirus does point out is that we are all interlinked, both on trade, on health, on the environment. So the idea of the U.S. and President Trump going alone, we can make our own trade rules. We don't have to follow the rules on the environment and on trade is really, the coronavirus says, no, that doesn't work anymore. We're much too interconnected as a global economy to try and pull out and walk away and turn our back on trade.
To what extent are farmers out here very conscious about the climate as well? I've heard things about that they really do pay attention, obviously, as farmers need to the climate. Well,
Secretary Vilsack told me there's still some climate issues because he said that when they would survey farmers, something like 80% would say weather patterns have changed my farming. And then the next question is, what about climate? No, climate change is not an issue.
Isn't that, they do not connect the two.
And I think the word climate change became such a toxic word and became so associated with too much progressive and too partisan, as opposed to, of course, they know weather's changing and it's changing their farming patterns, but they don't want to say it's climate change.
So, Fred, you've been out here in Iowa for a while, talking, I suspect, a lot to Democrats, not entirely, but a lot to Democrats. Do you have a sense of what the issues are on caucus goers' mind right now? What do you expect may tilt in one way or the other?
You know, this is hard to read right now, but I would say partly because it's hard to find actually a local citizen right now. There
are many media.
There's a lot.
That's right.
There's a lot of media, and I met somebody who called himself a political tourist who was in town. I think my sense of the people here, for having been here many times over the years, is they want a solid plan that can be implemented. They don't want just a lot of great ideas and a lot of rhetoric, but they really want to say, can a candidate, can someone actually change things and make my life better? And I think the Democrats as a whole are going to do that.
Well, but when you talk about Democrats and trade, Democrats historically have not been big free traders. If anything, they've been the protectionists. So are there any candidates here that we're looking at in Iowa who are coming up with a trade policy that, to your mind, makes a lot of sense?
Well, I think actually both Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden are much more leaning into trade and realizing we cannot cut off from the rest of the world. I would say that certainly Bernie Sanders is at the extreme in terms of, and Elizabeth Warren, both have said at some level, trade is what ruined this country. Trade is what destroyed jobs. Trade is what's destroyed incomes, destroyed the middle class. And I think that is extreme, and it isn't true. It's simply not true. So I think that, and that's not going to play so well.
At the same time, jobs have been lost. Manufacturing and other jobs have been lost, and neither party, to my way of thinking, has done a particularly strong job in figuring out what to do about that. It may not be the answer, just shut it down, shut trade down, but okay, if not that, then what?
Well, I do talk about some of this in my book.
I know you do.
And partly, I think we have to look at something called lifelong readiness. We have to tell people and make it clear, not like my parents, where you got one job for 30 years, you got a home with a 30-year mortgage, and at the end you retired, you had a pension, and you lived, quote unquote, rent-free. That fantasy is over. And I don't think we've really had a very frank and honest conversation with Americans about that. They know that's not the case, but we haven't really leveled with them.
But I'll bring you back to this caucus and the campaign right now. Do you hear that from any candidates? Is that on the agenda?
I have not heard enough about how we're going to really prepare ourselves. Because trade is a small part of it. A bigger part is going to be artificial intelligence, automation, which has had a much bigger impact, frankly, than trade. And one thing about artificial intelligence, automation, it is across the entire country. It has no geographic bounds, no industry bounds. So it's going to be far more pervasive, far more far-reaching.
Is it possible it's a zero-sum game? That, in fact, you were just going to lose certainly good-paying jobs, period?
Well, I think we're going to create a lot of other jobs. I mean,
it will be good-paying jobs, you think?
I mean, here we are, we're at Bloomberg Television, okay? I mean, the entertainment business, movies, television, cable, has created many, many good jobs, and frankly, really good high-paying jobs and good labor union jobs. So we just have to sort of change our view. It's not just going to be with a lunch pail and a factory. That's the 20th century. We do so many things well in the 21st century. People here realize that, and that's what we have to capitalize on.
Really great to have you with us and catch up with you out here in Des Moines, Iowa. That is Fred Hochberg. He's the former chairman and president of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. And as I said, the author of Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word. Still ahead, chasing the youth vote. Part of my conversation with Tanner Halloran. He's Iowa Democratic Party's second vice chair. Why he says Iowa is an exciting state for young voters. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin in Des Moines, Iowa for the caucuses coming up just a few hours from right now. Democratic candidates are sounding right now the last alarm to get their voters out in Iowa before the caucuses tonight. And we're turning to one demographic in particular. They're trying to get the youth vote. I spoke with Tanner Halloran. He's Iowa Democratic Party's second vice chair about their efforts to keep young voters involved beyond tonight's caucuses and more.
Overall, in general, organizing has really changed to create this longevity of making sure that youth come back rather than, we want you to caucus and then we're not going to talk to you again for a while. I think that the way that we're doing this and approaching this is very different so that we do see youth turning out to vote, too, in November.
Why is the Iowa process so complicated?
We're going to need more time to answer that. No, I'm just joking, though. So the Iowa Democratic Party really wants to make this process the most democratic that we can by having it so that everyone is heard. And so, it does look different than other processes, but our process allows that everyone is heard from young to old, different demographics, sex, age, race, you name it. We want to make sure that people's voices are heard.
You particularly are involved in youth engagement, as you said. That's a project you've taken on. One of the issues that's been raised by Iowa is, as wonderful as the state is, it's not the most diverse state in the union. And when you're looking toward a general election, it's a much more diverse electorate. You have a very low, for example, African-American population. I think 3 or 4%, something like that. Can it be a proper indicator of who the president of the United States should be, or the candidate for president of the United States should be?
Yeah, I think we've heard these challenges to the caucus for a while now. One thing I think that we can kind of point to is that, again, everyone can have their voice heard in Iowa. There's a lot more pros than there are cons, and I think, again, everyone's voices can be heard. It's easy to buy media space, so you can reach every demographic. You can easily travel the state. Also, just within the Democratic Party, we have the far left, the moderates. Everyone's voices are heard here, and so for candidates, you're really getting a somewhat demographic representation there.
Tanner, you've said you've committed yourself to increasing the engagement of the youth in the process. That's on the Democratic side. You're part of the Democratic Party. Right. Do you see the same thing going on the other side of the aisle? Are the youth of Iowa also, who are Republicans, more engaged than they have been in the past?
Yeah, those are separate institutions, of course, and different separate parties. So I don't want to speak to what they're doing because I'm not as knowledgeable on that. But I definitely think that both parties are kind of starting to realize that the old guard is going out and the new guard is coming in. So definitely wanting to engage youth to kind of win elections in the future.
You're a college student. What are you seeing on the campus right now in terms of people talking about becoming motivated to act with respect to the election on either side?
Yeah, I think a lot of youth are engaged again and starting to pay attention. I know a lot of my friends and peers are excited about the caucus tomorrow. On Drake's campus, 70% of students are from out of state, and a lot of them are switching their voter registration here because they want to take part in this process. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So a lot of students are becoming engaged. They're paying attention to candidates, they're going to events, and ultimately I think we're going to see them come out in November as well.
That was Tanner Halloran, Iowa Democratic Party's second vice chair I talked to over the weekend. Joining us tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern Time and 9 p.m. here in Iowa for complete coverage of the Iowa caucus results. Also ahead today, Donald Trump Jr. will sit down with Kevin Cirilli. He's part of the president's surrogates who are here for the caucuses. That's coming up at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From Des Moines, Iowa, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. For that, we go to Ritika Gupta in New York. Ritika?
The stock is surging, adding more than $100 per share. It's a fifth day of gains for the electric car maker. Panasonic says its business making batteries for Tesla at a plant in Nevada turned profitable. Another boost came from analysts at Argus, which raised price targets on Tesla to a street high of $808. House managers are urging the Senate to remove President Trump from office. The impeachment trial convened today to hear closing arguments, with the House managers and Trump's defense each getting 2 hours. After that, the Senate floor will be open for members to explain which way they plan to vote. The final decision is scheduled for 4 p.m. Wednesday, when President Trump is almost certain to be acquitted. Bernie Sanders is seen as the likely winner of the first major test for Democratic presidential contenders. The Iowa caucuses are tonight, and a new Emerson College poll has Sanders winning with 28%, with Joe Biden at 21%. One-time Iowa frontrunner Elizabeth Warren is in a virtual tie for third at 14%. A poll showing tonight could be devastating to her campaign. And the coronavirus outbreak has got China rethinking its growth plans. Bloomberg has learned that Beijing is evaluating whether the target for growth should be lowered. It's part of a broader review of how the government's plans will be affected by the deadly virus. The number of cases of the disease in China has now soared past 17,000. More than 360 people have died. Outside of China, the Philippines has reported the first death. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo wants some assurances from the Taliban. Speaking in Uzbekistan today, Pompeo said he needs to see evidence that the Taliban can and will reduce violence before signing a deal that would lead to Afghanistan peace talks. It would also mean a withdrawal of American troops from the country. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
The Iowa caucuses are the first presidential contest on the calendar, and they're much different than a traditional primary. Democrats operate theirs like this. Caucuses will take place in all of Iowa's 1,678 precincts, plus 99 satellite locations. Once gathered, caucus goers will select their choice of president by splitting into groups. A candidate needs at least 15% of the room to remain viable. Otherwise, their supporters are released and open to select another candidate. And precinct captains will use all manners of persuasion to win additional support. From there, the second and final count is taken. Then the state party calculates how many state delegate equivalents each candidate has won at each caucus location. For the first time, the Iowa Democratic Party will report the results from all rounds of voting, but the key numbers are the state delegate equivalents.
We continue our coverage of the Iowa caucuses now with Dennis Goldford. He is professor of political science at Drake University, and he's the co-author of The Iowa Precinct Caucuses, The Making of a Media Event. He joins us now alongside Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino. So, Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
You've persuaded one thing. It is a media event. You've accomplished that. But we've just heard a basic explanation of how it works. How did we come up with this contraption? Why are we doing this?
Iowa has always had caucuses since statehood. And originally, they didn't have anything directly to do with presidential politics. Presidential politics got piggybacked onto Iowa caucuses, at least in the modern era, when the people around George McGovern in '72 were looking for some place to make a little bit of a splash. And they did, but not major. But of course, I always say it's Jimmy Carter's fault. So it's purely an historical accident that the caucuses have taken on the role they have. Nobody rationally sat down with a list of criteria and said Iowa is the state we should start in.
And so we hear a lot of criticism in terms of this issue of inclusivity and also this issue in terms of the demographics of Iowa. And so as a fellow political scientist, but also as an Iowan, how do you respond to those sort of criticisms of the caucus today?
I'm often asked, are the people of Iowa all excited about caucuses coming up? And to be a little bit snarky, I say no, and people are stunned. But historically, on average, only about 2 in 10 Iowans bothered to participate in a caucus, if that much, 1 in 5. The big year was the Obama year in 2008, when 2 in 5 showed up, meaning only 3 in 5 didn't. But The caucuses are not a primary election, they're not a general election, they're not run by the state election machinery. They're basically the business meetings of two private organizations, the Republican and Democratic parties. And so there's no election or voting window. You have to show up at 7 o'clock on a Monday night in the dead of winter, hoping the babysitter shows up, the kid's not sick, your car starts, and there's no flat tire, and there's no blizzard.
So, someone who's run many campaigns for president here in Iowa, what's the future of the Iowa caucus? Because certainly from, I think, a practitioner's point of view, a primary would be perfectly nice here in the frigid state of Iowa in the middle of the winter during election season. And we've seen some changes this cycle. Does somebody like Bernie win in the caucus and potentially going on to become the nominee drive a lot of Democrats to saying, wow, maybe we shouldn't hold it this way?
Well, there's some concerns in that regard because Sanders is someone who is not officially a Democrat and has chosen to remain not a Democrat. But, right. I've always said that Iowa is not first because it's important. Iowa is important because it's first. As you would know as a practitioner, whoever goes first in a serial nomination process has extra impact. And if the 41 delegates, the pledged delegates, matter to the nomination when there are just under 4,000 delegates to that convention, the Democrats have a lot bigger problems than the complexity of the Iowa caucuses. What matters about Iowa is simply that Iowa is an indicator to the rest of the country of what real party activists, not a polling sample, not people on the street that journalists might interview, what they think based upon their interest, concern, and tremendous knowledge of politics, what they think of their menu of possible nominees for the party.
And I was just going to ask you, since your book, which is a fabulous book, what do you think the media traditionally get wrong about the Iowa caucus? If there was one thing you could correct about media coverage of the caucus, what would it be?
I think it's the focus on delegates, because, as I said, the delegates aren't enough to matter. What every candidate runs against in Iowa, and you may have had this experience,
expectations.
Expectations. I say every candidate's got the same opponent. That opponent's name is expected. So the key thing is, did you do better than expected or worse than expected? This time around, for example, if Sanders or Warren or Biden were to finish first or second, more or less, okay, that's important, but that's a kind of dog bites man story. If Amy Klobuchar, sitting out there in a distant fifth, were to show up in second or even a strong third, that's a man bites dog story. That's important. All of a sudden, the attention turns to her.
Professor, however we got here, and however Rube Goldberg it may appear to some of the rest of us around the country, has it done a pretty good job over time? If you look back through history, has it by and large, on average, over time, picked out the strongest or one of the strongest candidates?
Well, of course, it all depends upon what you mean by doing a good job. I mean, there are two good effects of the caucuses, even if they weren't part of the initial attention. The first is that they offer candidates a chance to try out themselves as their message and as a candidate. It's like building a race car, putting it out on the track and seeing how well the car and the drivers perform. So that's a good thing about the caucuses. The second thing is that they force candidates to talk to voters as real human beings, not as simply campaign props for photo ops. Journalists aren't supposed to become the story, so there's a limit to the point to which you can press a candidate on a particular question. That doesn't apply to voters. In various venues, folks here can say, what do you think about that? I don't know what you say. But as long as journalists think Iowa's important, candidates will think Iowa's important. And as long as candidates think Iowa's important, journalists will think Iowa's important.
Following along with that, I mean, it gets an inordinate amount of attention when you look at the amount of time a candidate spends in Iowa. Sure. Per capita, a very small state, yes. Compared to literally the rest of the country, Iowans are getting a really good look. But is Iowa really the state that brings out the best national issues, the right demographics? I mean, it's a bit of a time capsule here in Iowa as far as the rest of the country is concerned.
Well, in our book, what I did was, and this is a couple cycles ago, I certainly pointed to this issue that I know is not demographically representative of the country. And that's not unimportant. At the same time, if you ask, what do Iowa Democrats think about which issues are the most important and what the right positions are, and ask the same question for Republicans, In fact, Iowa Democrats pretty well track Democrats nationwide, and Iowa Republicans pretty well track Republicans nationwide. But is there that demographic dimension to Iowa? No, certainly not.
Okay, many thanks to Professor Dennis Goldford. He is professor of political science at Drake University. Coming up here, more from my conversation with Democratic presidential candidate Tom Steyer, how he says Democrats can counter President Trump's economic agenda. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From Des Moines, Iowa, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. There's no question that the economic numbers under President Trump are strong, and traditionally that means that the incumbent is going to get another term. So how do Democrats counter that? I spoke to presidential candidate Tom Steyer.
That's why I want to be the nominee, because that actually what you're saying is not true. Is it a strong economy if it's growing, but all of the additional income goes to the richest Americans and the biggest corporations?
Well, but real wages are going up for the lowest quartile.
If you look at what's happened, you're saying we have low unemployment. People can't afford to live on the wages that this economy produces. People are having to hold down 2 and 3 jobs. If you look at really what's going on in the United States of America, this president gave the biggest tax cut in history to the richest Americans and the biggest corporations. If you look at the rates, we have a regressive tax structure. Rich people pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes than working people. That is absolutely unjust. The biggest corporations have an average tax rate of 11%. That is a crazy low number. The fact of the matter is, this is a president who is running an economy for the people at Mar-a-Lago, and the working Americans are getting absolutely left behind. And he said in his second term, he's going to balance the budget that he blew up with his tax cut for rich people by going after entitlements, namely people's health care spending. This is a guy who's been terrible for working Americans.
Let's take all of that at face value and say that's absolutely true.
It is true.
But do the Democrats have a communications problem? Because if you look at the polling right now, people give Donald Trump a lot of credit on the economy. They think the economy is doing well, and they give him credit for it. So is there a communications problem with all the campaigning going on out in Iowa, New Hampshire, places like that? I'm not sure the American people are hearing what you're saying.
Well, let me say this. That's why I want to be the candidate. Whoever's going to win. Mr. Trump's running on the economy. You know it. He says it every single day. I think 2 nights ago, he was in Des Moines and he said, if I don't win, your farms are going to go to hell. I mean, he doesn't have to have any logic or reason behind it. Actually, he's been a terrible president for farmers. Absolutely terrible with his trade war and his waivers for oil refineries in terms of biofuels. He's been a terrible president for Iowa farmers.
That was part of my conversation with Democratic presidential candidate Tom Steyer, campaigning out here in Iowa for those caucuses. We're back now with Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino, and we're joined by Robert Griffin. He's the research director for the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group. So welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've done a study here. You've done a lot of polling here. What can you tell us about the extent to which pocketbook issues will really drive voters this time?
So I think really the historical context is necessary here. We've got data from like the 20th century that says that the economy matters when it comes to how people vote. But what we've seen within the last 2 election cycles, so that's Barack Obama's sort of performance in 2012 and his presidency, as well as Trump's presidency, is there's a growing disconnect between people's sentiments about the economy and how well people are approving of them. And this is kind of in line with other research that's been done out there that says polarization has maybe gotten so bad that people are just not making a decision based on this. And even more than that, their perceptions of how the economy is doing is influenced by their partisanship.
So, Robert, that sounds like the polarization is what's driving apart people's attitudes toward the economy. How then do you look at that and say, well, you know, in most of the public opinion polls, as David said to candidate Steyer, that Trump is actually getting a lion's share of the public support, over 50%, that support him on the economy?
Well, you can have people support them on the economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be driving their vote at the end of the day. I mean, again, look at his approval numbers overall. This is a person where we've had the economy going into, less than 5% unemployment, wages are growing, and yet his approval ratings overall cannot break this sort of like high 30s, low 40s numbers.
Well, if it isn't the economy, then what is it? Because traditionally we think it's pocketbook issues. I mean, in the off-year election, in the midterm election, it appeared to be health care, but that's really closely related to people's personal financial situation.
I think if we especially look at, let's say, 2012 to 2016, one of the growing sort of movers of people's opinions is actually their attitudes about more social issues. So attitudes about race, attitudes about immigration, attitudes about gender. These are becoming increasingly correlated with people's opinions overall. And again, those are some things that are very core to people's identity and their understanding of the world. If you have sort of daylight between maybe how they feel about the economy and how they feel about these other things that are a bit closer to the heart, the evidence so far appears to be that the economy is becoming just a bit less important relative to those.
So can I ask you how much of this, and I'm sure you controlled for this in your study, has to do with the fact that when the economy is strong, to your point, people have the option of looking at other issues, right? Unemployment is 3.5% lower than that in Iowa. So we have the option of looking at other issues. How much of that would change if the economy wasn't doing so well, and then people say, aha, we're really going to think about the economy more as we vote? In other words, how much do you control for the good economic numbers out there?
Yeah, so I think in the past we've seen good economic numbers, good consumer confidence, but it's lined up with good presidential approval in the past. And I think just to your point, though, does this mean that the economy has no effect? It doesn't mean it has no effect. It's probably just less than if we rewound the clock and looked at what was going on maybe 20 years ago. So again, if there was a recession today, I think Trump's numbers would tank a little bit, but it's not going to probably be take as much of a hit as we would have seen in the past. What I like to say about this is there are sort of lower ceilings and higher floors to American presidential approval because people's attitudes are a bit more locked in.
Even with the advent of millennials into the voting age population, I mean, this is the largest single group of voters in one generation that we're going to see come through, really, in modern history. Yeah. How do you see them affecting this dynamic? Not so much on the polarization, because they inherit that, but on economic issues in particular.
Well, so, again, I think what's happened to this generation in particular, what we've seen in the past, as generations get older, they get a bit more conservative. And that's often connected to the signs of adulthood. I'm getting married. I'm buying a house. I'm having a 401k. The issue is that the recession actually delayed a lot of these events for millennials. So this is a generation that so far has not really grown more conservative as it's gotten older. And as you're saying, it's getting bigger and bigger by the year. And often these economic pressures, these life consideration pressures, are not having the same influence on them that they did previous generations.
So let me ask what, for me, is the ultimate question. Do facts not matter as much? When you say people's perception of the economy and their is influenced by their partisanship, I mean, those things are factual. I mean, the number is 100 or it's 50. But is it really a diminution of the importance of facts?
Yeah, I think there is something to that. The analogy I like to use is hurricane partisanship. Everything is getting caught up in the sway of that sort of piece of people's identity. Everything's starting to be seen through that lens. It doesn't mean things have no effect. It doesn't mean facts are worthless or anything like that. But it does mean that compared to the expectations that we had in the past, we should start to downgrade how important these things are a little bit.
So in that earlier package, Steyer says he's going to take the economy as his number one issue if he's the nominee. Isn't he barking up the wrong tree?
Yeah, it may well be. I mean, I think to the extent that the Democrats have sort of a strong platform to run on, the economy is doing quite well. You're going to run on Trump's strengths. That doesn't make a ton of sense. And it's really interesting to see if Trump himself can stick to that point. He often has not shown the discipline, especially in the 2016 race, to sort of focus on the issues where he's doing best.
Many thanks to Robert Griffin. He is Democracy Fund Voter Study Group Research Director. Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino are going to be sticking with us for some final thoughts before the caucus. And a programming note now, we will have special coverage of tonight's results. That's going to start at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and on radio. And tomorrow, President Trump is going to deliver his State of the Union address, and we're going to have live coverage of that as well, and also of the Democratic response. That starts at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on radio. For our Bloomberg Television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin from Des Moines, Iowa, covering these Iowa caucuses. And joining us now with some final thoughts is Bloomberg national political reporter Tyler Pager. Also with us are our Bloomberg contributors, Rick Davis, who managed John McCain's presidential campaign, and Jeannie Zaino of Iona College. So, Tyler, give us the final thoughts, particularly about Bernie Sanders seems to be the story right now, at least among the media people out here.
Yeah, I think that's the big story. We're seeing it on the ground. You're seeing it when you talk to Democratic operatives across the state. this is Bernie Sanders' caucus to win. And if he does that, that sends a clear message that he is the progressive standard bearer of this race. And he heads into New Hampshire with even more momentum than he did when he trounced Hillary Clinton there in 2016.
How much of an impact of being the progressive standard bearer does that have on someone like Elizabeth Warren, who's been the pretender to that throne?
Right. I think it really depends on the voting margin and the delegate margin. There's not that many delegates here at play in Iowa, but if he takes out a big lead there, that just sends the message. And Iowa is not about delegates as much as it is about momentum and narrative. And so what we're going to see here is if Bernie Sanders claims victory and heads to New Hampshire, where he's already the favorite there, that could really be a 1-2 punch for Bernie Sanders and hurt Elizabeth Warren's candidacy.
What is Joe Biden looking to do to just get out of here and get to New Hampshire and then get himself to South Carolina?
I mean, the thing for Joe Biden is New Hampshire's not a strong point for him either. That's going to be another place where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are going to be duking it out for 1 and 2, both neighboring senators. I think Joe Biden really needs to just survive in advance and reassure his donors and his voting base that once the states open up a little bit and you get into Nevada and South Carolina, that's where his time is really he needs to win there in order to continue on.
So the one person we haven't talked about who's in the top tier is Pete Buttigieg.
Exactly.
He's having big crowds. He's got a great organization. Yeah. You know, people here are talking a lot about him. Where do you think he's got to come out?
Yeah, I think he's got to come top 3. Probably maybe even top 2. This is his state. He has staked his entire candidacy on doing well here and in New Hampshire to catapult him and to make inroads with voters of color. They've been arguing that since the beginning and invested a lot of time and resources here.
But does he have more flexibility? Because there aren't quite as many expectations for him. And if Bernie Sanders does not win, it might be a big disappointment. And similarly, if Joe Biden comes in 4th or even 3rd.
Right. I think for Pete Buttigieg, he definitely wants to be the leading moderate, beating out Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar here and prove that electability narrative. That's one of the things that's dogged him. He's 38 years old. He's only been the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He needs to prove that he can win, and this is the first test.
Is Amy Klobuchar going to have a difficult decision tonight, depending on what happens? Because she's the one who really has the neighboring, senator. And
right. I think if she comes in the top 4, that's a big win for her. That means she's knocked out one of the top-tier candidates. I still see her going forward to New Hampshire. If she finished 5th, she got endorsed by the largest newspaper there. She has some good endorsements from elected officials. I see her going there, but again, she does need to have a good night here and in New Hampshire.
So the last Minnesotan who ran in Iowa was Pawlenty, and he staked his campaign on the neighboring state here in Iowa, and basically it killed his candidacy when he didn't come in the top tier. You think that Amy can survive that?
I think so, just because of what the expectations have set. I think she could have a strong finish. She's visited all 99 counties, the only top-tier candidate to do that. Wow. I think it's a difficult path for her, regardless of that, because what happens in Iowa. But
that's the best fact. She visited 99 counties. That'll tell you something. Many thanks now to Bloomberg's Tyler Pager, and of course to our Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino. And stay tuned for a special coverage of tonight's results. That starts at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio, live from Des Moines. This is Bloomberg.